It's the Misfits.
Hi, my name is Christian Taylor, and I met Jesus when I was 3 years old, living with mom and dad in a little country house in Laurel, Mississippi. I remember my mom told me who Jesus was, and I remember kneeling beside my bed and asking him to come into my heart, which is really trite. I know it sounds really trite, but it was very precious, and I've never forgotten it. So that was just the beginning of my journey with Jesus. So there's a lot more to come.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. Today I believe we're on episode 8.
Sure.
Yeah, episode 8 for this week. We're actually doing something different for ourselves. 2 in 1 week for
That's
recording.
Right.
It'll still be released
this
on our normal timing.
This is the third interview within the past 7 days.
Yes.
Because the interview you heard 2 weeks ago with Dr. Joshua Smith, we recorded 7 days ago. And then some of you already heard by the time we're recording this, but we did 2 days ago. We had our live show with Arthur
Agajanian.
Yes, there we go. Agajanian, where we talked about art and history and architecture and modern Protestantism. I can't even say Protestant. How was I going to say his name? And today we are going to have a special guest with us where this it was a last minute interview because schedules, you know how schedules are. I had a root canal yesterday, so we weren't sure how that was going to go. But we're all here, and we are here today with, if I can find the button, with Christian Taylor, who some of you may know her from a couple of the different things that she is on. She's on the Holy Post podcast. She is a documentary maker with The Girl Who Wore Freedom. She's also an award-winning documentary winner because she's won quite a few awards with The Girl Who Wore Freedom. She's currently working on another film, and she also goes by and sometimes Christian. So, Christian, welcome to Ministry Misfits. We are glad that we were able to kind of work our schedules around to do this because you have a very misfit-esque story, both just in your calling, in your call to faith, your upbringing, and especially with the work that you're doing now with the king of Christian cartoon comedy, Phil Vischer. Let's start off by just introducing who you are, because you have quite a career within media, and people probably have heard you or seen the work you do and probably don't actually know who you are. So just give us a little introduction as to who Christian Taylor is.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me here. It's super nice to meet you. I was delighted to learn about your podcast. I didn't even know until you reached out to me that this is what you were doing. I read a little bit about what you guys are doing, listened to a little bit of your podcast, and I just want to say congratulations. I'm glad you're out there doing what you're doing. It's important work. And thanks for having me. So, like you said, my name is Christian, and I do have a very interesting story. I do play behind the scenes oftentimes on the Holy Post podcast, which I'm delighted to be on. I was one of the founding members of the podcast with Phil Vischer and Sky Jitani. It's been an integral part of my life and learning and growth.
And you actually, if I remember right, aren't you the one that actually convinced them to do it because they weren't going to until you made them?
That is my recollection. My recollection is also that I was the one that forced Phil to get on Twitter, which now
you're regretting that a little bit. Yeah.
You can't, go back and change that.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. I mean, when I first started working professionally with Phil, I think it was like 2012, something like that. And I had been hired to produce a television talk show, which never saw the light of day, but it was awfully fun. And then they asked me to help produce episode 13 of What's in the Bible. So during that time, he wasn't on any social media at all. He really was very introverted, super private. And But he was connecting with college kids when he would go around and speak at campuses. And I saw the power for kids in that, that they'd grown up and, really thrived on the children's program he was doing, but really had no clue who he was. And so when he went around talking at colleges, people got a taste of who he was as a Christian, as a leader, as a deep thinker, and they wanted more of that because now they were older and thinking more deeply and curious about what he said. So yes, when the TV show talk show was canned, I was like, well, let's do it. Let's do a podcast. It's free, didn't cost anything, and we can have people come in and chat. So that was the beginning.
Awesome. And yeah, you were a early sort of pioneer for non-church Christian podcasts. I actually hadn't even heard of you. Greg and I came along about 2 years later doing the same sort of thing for CSRM, but you guys were one of the first ones out there and grew pretty quickly. But it wasn't just because it was Phil Vischer. It was because of the stories that you guys were sharing, including your own stories, which is part of what we're going to talk about today. So let's start off. You sound right now like we're talking to a fellow Midwesterner. However, we also know, those of anybody that has heard you knows that is not actually the case.
Yeah, I mean, in my heart, I'm from Laurel, Mississippi, and when I talk to my family, apparently I'm told this is the way I sound.
Yeah.
So
let's start there. You grew up in the Deep South. Let's just start there, because I mean, there's a lot to go with just from right there. Mm-hmm. What was it like growing up in the Deep South? Because you're in the Bible Belt, you're in Mississippi. You already shared in your testimony that you grew up in a Christian family. So take us back. What was it like growing up in the Deep South?
Well, in order for me to tell this story truthfully, I have to confess how old I am, which is always very shocking for me.
You're not going to be, don't worry, you are definitely not the oldest guest that we have had. And we have a couple that we're working on that are going to be probably almost, a good 30 years older than you. So don't worry.
Great. That's great. I like to think that I'm 35 because that's what I feel like. So we're just going to go with that. So I don't know how I'm able to tell you what I'm about to tell you, but I was born in 1966 into the segregated South. And of course, the civil rights movement had already begun. There were some strides made, but not in South Mississippi. In fact, the schools were not desegregated until 1979, when I was in seventh grade, 78 or 79. And so I do remember growing up. I don't know if you've seen The Help, the movie The Help, mm-hmm. but my situation growing up was very much like that, including that I had a wonderful woman in our lives named Marguerite Chandler, who grew up with my grandmother, then went to clean her home and raise her children, and then came to work in my parents' home and raise us. And I remember there being colored and white signs on the bathroom. I remember, just living on one side of the tracks and then a whole group of other people living on the other side of the tracks. And I never even visited over there until I was older. And our town is like the size of a head of a pin. So it's strange to think I never went to half of it my whole life. So.
Now, did you realize the segregation that was going on as a child, or was it more so? And I'm not sure. We'll get later into your story of when you moved out, of kind of reflecting back and be like, oh, that's a little bit differently than I would have probably remembered.
Well, it's interesting. I think my situation is unique in that I was living right down the street from Sam Bowers, who was the head of the KKK. And my father had a very dear friend who was on the site when they found Werner and Cheney, the civil rights workers outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. In fact, my father drove right by there when they were making that discovery on his way back to college. So I was in that pot of stew that was stewing there. But my family always treated Black people as if they were family. There was this warm vibe. And of course, I was cared for by Marguerite. So in my mind, there was not this animosity. There was no negative talk towards Black people. So that's why when I look back now and I can see what was happening, I'm just stunned by what I see, because it was just as racist in my mind as the outright, torture of Black people in Mississippi. So usually the Black people that I had interaction with were the servants of sorts, the people that worked on our cars. It feels like the driving Miss Daisy thing was also very present. My father built houses, and so he always would talk about the houses that he built in Hoy Green Acres for the poor Black people. So in my mind, and I do think there was a part of it that my parents had compassion towards Black people, but there was just a line where we did not interface with them at all. There was no standing in the gap on their behalf. As long as everything was status quo and everybody was getting along, there really were no ruffles. So as a child, I didn't know the difference. Although now I look back, we collected little Black babies and they were called niglets. And I just am horrified about that. And there's other little things that were in my growing up that I didn't even realize, of course, until much, much later.
So let's actually start there with you. How did you actually kind of start this process of recognizing the culture that you grow up compared to what you felt like you as a believer, you as just a human being, how you were actually supposed to interact with people of different ethnicities? Was it something that was just like there was one moment of wake up, or was this a process?
Oh my gosh, a process that is still unfolding. I'm still learning the prejudice that exists in my, operating system that I didn't even know was there. And I think when I grew up, all I knew was there were Black people and there were white people. That was it in my world. I am so grateful that in 1979, it's a little bit of a troubled girl. And I look back now, which I think is totally laughable because I really wasn't that bad. But my parents were youth group leaders. And so they were working with high school kids, and they understood that drugs were coming into the school and, demographics were changing. I'm not really sure what they were so afraid of. But when they saw me doing, lying to them, writing to school with a boy that they didn't like. It's a hilarious story, by the way, because I would walk. I really liked this boy named David Wright, and I would walk to the bus stop. And my mother was trying to control my behavior, so she was making me wear a dress every day to school, which was horrifying for an 8th grader. And so I would put my dress on and I would put my jeans and everything else under the dress. I would get to the bus stop. I would take off the dress, put it in my backpack, wait for David Wright to drive by in his powder blue Monte Carlo, get in the car and ride to school. And one day I am standing there and David Wright goes flying by the bus stop. And I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? And then I see my dad's Cherokee Chief flying after him. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. I had to ride the bus all the way to school, not having a clue about what was happening and scared to death. And I get to school, I see my dad confronting him in the parking lot. I walk right into class. And about 30 minutes later, I get a call down to the office and my father withdraws me from school. And that was the last day I was in public school in Mississippi. And my father put me in the car and said, your mom has packed your bag. I don't know where we're going or when we're going to be back, but we're going to sort this mess out. And he ended up leaving me in Florida with some people that used to be in his youth group. They got married, moved down there, and he enrolled me in Patone Christian School and left me. And it was super traumatic, of course. I finished out my 8th grade there. And while I was in school there, they became friends with Elizabeth Elliot, I don't know if you know who Elizabeth Elliot is, but she was a missionary to the Auca Indians in Ecuador. Her husband, Jim Elliot, was killed by those Indians that they were trying to witness to. And her daughter and son-in-law were pastors in our church, in our town. And so Elizabeth was on the board of the Stony Brook School in Long Island, New York. And she suggested my parents put me there. And that's what happened.
For those that don't know who she's talking about, the easiest way to find it would actually just be to Google them. But if you go and look up the End of the Spear book, End of the Spear movie,
Tip of the Spear.
Tip of the Spear, sorry. And then also Gates of Splendor is the other one. You can find out their full story, which you have quite the network of connections now, don't you?
Yeah, it's not something that I, even knew was really happening. I mean, I remember when Josh McDowell came and came to my parents' home and spoke to our youth group. This is right after he wrote Evidence Demands a Verdict. And so I really was, around a lot of these, Christian thinkers in the 70s and 80s. And I had no idea. I was very blessed to have a lot of that stuff poured into me as a young child. And then, what's funny? I live in Wheaton, Illinois. And I remember when I went to Stony Brook, it was this Christian boarding school in Long Island. And a ton of people were going to Wheaton College after we graduated. And I'm like, I will not be caught dead at Wheaton College. I do not want to go to another Stony Brook. And God is such a hilarious sense of humor because I've lived here now 25 years, right next to the college. And you do not know how many times I've been like, dang it, why didn't I go to Wheaton? Such an awesome college.
I feel like I said the same thing about Malone for a little while. I was like, this looks like a rundown school. Like, I don't want to go here. And then sure enough, that rundown school I talked about was
got there.
True, it should have been. But like you said, God has a sense of humor and
even more of a sense of humor because now you live across the street from there.
True.
So, it's just a continual cycle. So we're getting into, we have had national desegregation now within your story. You've now been shipped off to Florida with, one of the most famous Christian writers in that, or, missionaries, writers in that time period. Walk us through now here before we go to break. How do we get to recognizing that perhaps, even with all of these Christian thinkers that you're associated with, maybe you're missing a piece to all of this, or at least missing what reality actually looks like for you as Christian and as a Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was in the process of answering that story when I got distracted by all my stories, which I am a storyteller. It's why I became a documentary filmmaker. But the answer to that was when I was sent to the Stony Brook School. I was 13 years old. It was 1980, I think, 79 or 80. I can't remember. It was before Ronald Reagan was elected president. So I think it was probably 79. Anyway, when I went to Stony Brook, the very first day that I was there, I knew nothing about Stony Brook. All I knew was that it was a Christian boarding school in Long Island, New York. That's it. My parents, drove me up there, moved me into my dorm room. And the next morning, a girl comes up to me and says, do you want to go to the deli and get a bagel? And that was a foreign language to me. I had no idea, never heard of a deli, had no idea what a bagel was. All of a sudden I was in a different country. And at this school, there were people that looked very different from me. There were a lot of white, evangelical type kids there, but there were missionary kids from everywhere. There were inner city kids from, New York that were now in this school. There were Asian kids there. There were Hispanic families there. It was what Hope Heaven is like. And so for me, I really began to see things differently. And because thankfully my parents had raised me in a way that I didn't have any negative opinions about anyone, I was able to just be friends with these people, even though they were different. And that expanded my worldview, along with the incredible education that I got at Stony Brook, where I began to understand just these issues that were at play among people. I remember in one Bible class, my teacher had me talk about what I had just experienced in Mississippi, and people in the class were horrified. And so I realized that my experience was unique and not everybody grew up like this. So that was my very first beginning of realizing that the world had a different reality than I grew up in. And that was the beginning. But truthfully, throughout all of my adult life, as I then, my father worked in the Reagan administration in the East. So we moved from Mississippi to DC. That was another, meeting a whole bunch of different people from all over the world was another shift. And then when I married my husband and we moved to Chicago, and I moved into very white Wheaton, sadly. By that time, I was, working on the Holy Post podcast. And so meeting with Phil and Sky every week, meeting the authors, writers, and teachers that would come on the show, even being exposed to what Phil and Sky were talking about, it's taken me a long time to unpack all of this prejudice that were in there. So just like my own Christian faith, this issue grew, changed, and there's still more work to do for me, I think.
And that time at Stony Brook, initially when you were sharing your experiences growing up, did it seem like you were ashamed to tell the experiences that you had, or did you see it as a opportunity to share with other people from another lens or perspective of what was reality for you growing up?
That's no one's ever asked me that before.
We get that response at least one time in interviews, so I think we must be doing something right with our questions.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, of course, I haven't thought about this before, but my first response to what you were saying was that in Mississippi, there is this incredible pride, state pride, that is baked into us from babies. Like, somebody once said that Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, where my parents both went, considers itself to be the Oxford of the South or the Harvard of the South. And it's so true. And, Laurel, Mississippi considers itself to be, the New York City or Boston, Massachusetts of the South as well. Like, it's a wealthy, educated community amidst this other southern thing. So I've always been super proud of where I came from, until recently, actually, because you're born to believe that, that it is the greatest state in the union. And it wasn't until I did go to high school that I realized, like, we had the lowest education rates. Like, we were at the bottom of the barrel in terms of all the different states for education and for just healthcare and, wealth disparity, So I was super proud of that. And I don't think I really understood, even in the early 80s, even though our schools had just been desegregated, it was all scrambled in my mind. And I really didn't understand how bad it was until I got much older.
So we're going to take a quick break here from our season 2 sponsors here. But when we get back, we're going to dive more into this kind of unraveling of the mystery that she just laid out for us. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
Season 2 of the Ministry Misfits podcast and our awesome theme song are brought to you by Laird Creative Agency.
In our social media world, the next connection is always one click or scroll away, and your business has to be ready when they find you.
That's why Laird Creative is always looking for ways to step your brand up. Whether you're looking to overhaul your brand one time with a new website or want to save money by outsourcing your graphic and media content, Laird Creative Agency is here to help. Laird Creative's mission is to take the difficulty out of the creative process. With Laird Creative, you'll find a dedicated team of artists ready to tackle any creative need that your business has, big or small.
If you're looking for an easier way to share the vision of your organization through thoughtful branding and creative content, find them at lairdcreativeagency.com to get started. Mention the Ministry Misfits podcast and get a free consultation call. Laird Creative, step your brand up.
As an American, I probably know more about World War II than any other war in our history. But I had no idea how little I really knew about the soldiers that fought and died for my freedom. I knew even less about the men, women, and children they liberated. Until this D-Day. This is the D-Day that changed me. And it's where I truly learned about freedom.
My name is Daniel Patrix. 1 year after being liberated from German control, I found myself standing in a ceremony on Utah Beach, wearing a new dress sewn by my mother Cecile. It was made from parachutes of the soldiers who fought valiantly to liberate me, my family, my neighbors, and all of France from Hitler's terrible grasp.
In Normandy, celebrations of remembrance and gratitude take place every year. French citizens bring World War II veterans and their families to Normandy to share their stories. In doing so, the French, once liberated by the Americans, liberate these soldiers in return from their oppressive memories of war.
Freedom is not free. It's too important to never forget.
That some boys went ashore on our beaches to fight in a hell, to liberate people they even didn't know. Then you realize what they have done and the sacrifice that many of them have made.
Dans tous les cimetières, il y a eu tant de morts pour sauver la France et tous les pays qui étaient occupés par l'Allemagne. Où qu'on serait aujourd'hui, nous Français, si vous les Américains, vous n'étiez pas venus.
The Americans, they are our liberators. We have to thank them forever, really.
The Girl Who Wore Freedom is an unconventional love story between the people of Normandy and the American GIs who freed them from German occupation that continues today.
These are our stories. Normandy's stories.
We're back.
All right, everybody, welcome back. We are still here with Christian Taylor, and she has just walked us through pretty much into her early adulthood, going through the segregated South into the desegregated South, into, all of her network connections between the Elliots and the Reagans. But now we are going to start talking a little bit about where you were at faith journey wise through all of this. Because you talked about the realization just for you personally of being at a domestic boarding school and realizing what diversity looked like. We talked a little bit about even, going into Chicago and what that was like. Now you're working with, a multi-ethnic cast basically within the Holy Post. But let's talk through the process for you faith-wise, because, we've talked about on here before with guys like Antoine Malone and Chalmer Williams about the fact that segregation had some theological implications in the South. What was that process like for you growing up, going to a deep Southern church, as far as how you started kind of deconstructing that part of your faith?
So it's interesting. Again, I didn't realize this till much later, but the pastor that led my parents to Christ, Bob Marsh, who's a phenomenal preacher, teacher. Bob Marsh was the pastor of First Baptist Church in Laurel. And what I learned later is that he really was trying to work with the Black churches to begin to integrate more fully. And eventually, I'm not sure if it was necessarily because of that, but he was run out of on a rail from our church. And that was very sad for our family. He moved to Dothan, Alabama, and went to First Baptist Church there, I think, or Peachtree Baptist. I can't remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But there was a time when Bob Marsh was at our church. It was just like this move of the Holy Spirit. There were so many people coming to Christ and so much growth spiritually. And there's a whole bunch of people that are in my parents' youth group that still talk and get together about the powerful move of the Holy Spirit. And I was in that time. And I do feel like the Lord cemented my relationship with him during that early time. I felt his love. I felt his reality. I saw him changing people around me. My mother stopped smoking. My father stopped drinking. There was just a real change in our family and in our church. And during that time, we would go to Lake Forest Ranch, which is a Christian camp in Macon, Mississippi, where Bob Marsh would speak. And we would go there for week-long periods of time. And this was a thing where, it's a basic summer camp, ride horses, water ski, swim, have Bible study classes. And we would have speakers that would come during the week. And every summer, I remember giving my heart to Jesus, walking down that aisle because I was so afraid I had not saved the first time. So there was just this understanding that every time I would get there, I was confronted with my fallen humanity. And I wanted to make sure that I was, walking with Christ. And I remember also him I would pray and see him move in my life during that time and was so certain of his reality. And that has never changed. That has never changed. I mean, that was a big watershed time during this, when I guess I was probably like 10 to 13, these kind of 3 years, maybe even a little earlier. And they would teach you spiritual rhythms like a quiet time. So there was a half an hour built in every morning where you would go and read your Bible, write in a journal, pray, enjoy the nature. And those things are just rooted in my soul. I still feel that connection when I do those things with Christ. So it was an amazing time for me spiritually at that camp. What was challenging, and I realized this later, when I went to Stony Brook, they began educating my mind, what the Bible said, putting that into context with history and the way we live with others. But I really see, as I look back, I was believing one thing in my spirit, believing one thing in my mind, but my actions were not changing. And a lot of that had to do with how I had bad language, or how I was always in a relationship with a boy. And that was always super important to me. I was always seeking after that. I remember when I went to Stony Brook, my father went to John Kenny, the football coach there, and said, "John, I'm leaving my daughter in your hands. You need to look after her." Because he was the football coach, he made me the football manager, which was like taking the, taking the cat into the hen house, or I don't know what analogy you want to use. But at the end of the year, John Kenny sat down with me and said, "Christian, let's go over how many boys you dated this year." And I think it was like 9 or 10, something like that. So it was really, as I look back now, I wasn't living what I said I believed. And that finally caught up with me when I did get pregnant outside of marriage around age 22. And there were a lot of forces at play there. A lot of it was that I was sadly abused by my mom as I was growing up, physically, from the time I was a little child. And of course, she came from a family where she was physically abused. And it only came out at certain times when she was angry. And it was like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. When she wasn't like that, she was the best mom in the world. And she still is. And we've done a lot of healing and stuff like that. But I was just in this, I had so much healing to do. But when I did get pregnant and I wasn't married, and I'd come from this, evangelical Christian Southern Baptist background, I felt like my life was over, and that I was the dirtiest thing ever, and that my life was really over. I remember, even though at this time I had been working on Capitol Hill, I started when I was 13 working in radio, television, broadcasting on the Hill. And I remember being so against abortion and marching against abortion. This was like, the whole moral majority time with Al Freed and, all of this in Washington. And I was a big part of that movement at the time. But as soon as I got pregnant at 22 in 1989, my first thought was, I'm going to have an abortion. And I remember looking in the yellow pages for an abortion clinic. I didn't even know how you got one. But I just knew my life was over and I needed to solve this problem. But as I was looking in the yellow pages for an abortion clinic, all of a sudden, like it just hit me. Like, this is a huge watershed moment for me where I realized I wasn't living what I said I believed. And if I really believed in who God said he was, and that he was Lord of my life, and I'd submitted my life to him, that I had to believe that this thing that was happening to me, that's the way I thought of it, would be used for good. And that all I can remember is I have to stop doing what is wrong. I have to do what is right. And I have to live what I say I believe. And so based on that, I put the yellow pages away and I committed to having this child and to figuring out a way to have a relationship with his father, a man I didn't really love. And he forced himself on me in a whole bunch of different ways. But I was like, okay, I'm going to commit to this and I'm going to try to make this work. And that's what I did. And I look back now. I'm sorry.
You're fine.
It's okay.
That son is 32 years old. And he has done some incredible things in his life and become an unbelievable man that I so respect and love. And in fact, he's completely responsible for the career change that I've had in the last 7 years. And we can get to that later, but that single choice to keep that child was the hardest thing I ever did in the moment. And it was also the hardest thing that I had ever done for the next, 20 years or so, in so many different ways. But it was the right thing to do. And I really feel like that is when I became a disciple of Jesus.
And that actually, leads us into part of what your story in particular, we talk about the, evangelistic disciple making. We talk about the 5 B's. And the 5 B's is kind of this process of discipleship that our argument is that this is biblically the way that we see it done. And so, belong, believe, baptize, behave, become. And what you right there are talking about is this idea of, you've always kind of felt like you belonged within the community and within the church. You've always believed it.
I did get baptized at 13.
You were baptized, but the behavior changes come after all of the belief and all of the baptizing. And once that behavioral change actually begins to take place is when we fully are able to become that disciple of Jesus that he calls us to be. And that's really what you're highlighting here, both from a personal standpoint and even from a cultural standpoint for you, is it wasn't until you recognized what needed to be changed that you were able to fully become the Christian, both in name and disciple,
believer, follower.
Yeah, there we go. That God actually had called you to be.
I'm curious too, going back to, I guess, those 5 B's, what was the one, I'll say one truth, I'm sure there was multiple, one truth that you clung to in that moment where you felt like life was over, this is it for me? What did the Holy Spirit speak into you? Or maybe it was somebody else that spoke into you that went back to that belief or truth. What was something that you clung on to in that moment to get you out of that deconstruction phase?
Well, I do know that I believed with all of my heart that God was real, that Jesus was his son, that he was a good God, that he died for my sins, and that he loved me. And I knew that if I loved him, I need a verse that said, if I loved him, I would obey what he commanded. And so in that moment, I realized I was not obeying what he commanded. Now, for me, it was limited having sex outside of marriage. Okay. And there's a whole thing that goes into this as well with the whole purity culture and all of that. It was all about, for me, the biggest sin I could recognize were the ones that I was caught up in. And that meant that I was not following Jesus. There were, of course, many others that I didn't really think about or know. So for me, that was stark, that I was not obeying what I said. I was not obeying God. I wasn't living what I said I believed. And interestingly enough, I had read Elizabeth Elliot's Passion and Purity my senior year of high school. And now I'm 20 years old. So that's like 4 years later. And I, wanted that kind of life that Elizabeth Elliot had, which I thought was good and right and healthy. Now I feel like it's a little messed up. That's another story for another time. But
yeah.
But and anyway, I knew that I wasn't living what I said I believed. And so I knew if I loved God, I had to obey him. And I knew that he loved me. And so even though I was going to have to walk through some hard things, I had to trust that all things, that happen, God can use for good to glorify him. And I wanted my life to do that. And interestingly enough, as I look back through my life, it is the absolute most horrible things, the things that are so painful, the things that I wish would never happen. It was all of those things that spiritually God used to form and shape me, to teach me who he is. And, we spend so much time running away and wanting good and comfort and happiness and health. We pray for those things all the time. And we think that's what life, quote unquote, is supposed to be. But as I look back on my life, we should be celebrating those hard, awful, disappointing, painful experiences, because, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire with Christ, that's where you see. And so, I clung on to the fact that God loves me, he forgives me, and that I need to learn to obey him even when it's painful.
That's really good. We need to transition one more step further within this whole reconstruction, deconstruction, process. And especially,
and by the way, let me just say one thing. I was deconstructing before deconstruction was ever a thing.
Right? Oh yeah. Don't worry. We got that. Yeah.
It seems like such a bad word now, but it was happening all along with many people all along. You either deconstruct and don't follow Christ, or you deconstruct and reformulate your faith in line with Scripture.
And part of what we talk about on here all the time is that the deconstruction, reconstruction process is something that realistically is a requirement within discipleship.
Yes.
But especially for us in the U.S., and this really goes back into, you've hit all the, the main target points for what we've labeled as Cold War theology that we talk about the church needing to separate from all the time. The moral majority Reagan era America, the deep South theological understanding of what everything means, the idea that you have to act a certain way in order to be a disciple, but it's all about what people see on the outside and nothing about what's on the inside. All of that kind of stuff is what we talk about all the time. We've got to get rid of that within our churches. For you growing up, you talk about the fact that your first pastor that you named, I'm assuming probably based off the way you're talking, probably the first one you remember as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
That was, he was one that was trying to do exactly what we've been talking about here.
Yes.
But it wasn't until you go off to school that you really experience it. As an adult, you fully experience what the love of Christ and what discipleship really looks like. Talk a little bit about, because you've shared on Holy Post a few times about this, and I think I've seen you share it on Twitter as well a couple of times. It's one thing to be able to go through this process and say, okay, I may not be able to go back to the church I grew up in. I may not be able to be a part of the same faith tradition I grew up in. But it's different when your family is involved.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. How have you gone about sort of the realizations that you've had, the realizations about the culture that you grew up in, the church culture that you grew up in. What has the process been like for you with your family, doing all of this sort of reconstructing and to borrow Paul's, showing yourself approved type of mindset?
It's been incredibly hard and painful, and it still is. And I don't have the answer, I'll tell you that. But I'll tell you that when I told my father, and again, the Christian nationalism thing is, I didn't even understand what that was. And I'm going to tell you, it's not a new thing. It was going on from the time that I was born and before. And I just had no idea that was not a healthy thing. I never knew that Democrats could be Christians. I mean, people that I grew up with were appalled if they just knew that all Democrats were, atheists and heathens. And, you could only be a, Christian if you were a Republican and vice versa. So I remember when I told my father I was not voting for Donald Trump. And he said, "You know what, Christian? I'm going to go take a hot shower, and I'm going to hope that melts out of my brain." And that was heartbreaking for me, because this was right after the time where the news came out about what Donald Trump said about women and grabbing them, which I will not repeat. But I was just appalled that my father with 4 daughters would just look right past that. And he was appalled that I wouldn't look right past that and vote for him anyway, because I was a Christian and I, should vote for what is right. But it's not just my father. There are plenty of people in my family who really question anybody that is not a conservative, white, evangelical Republican in their point of view. And I often cannot have those conversations at all, because if I do, they get very heated and I get very heated because I'm not good at managing my, injustice meter. And so what I've resolved to do is that I can only change what I can change. So in my mind, when I look at where they are, there is a tendency for me to judge them, to be angry with them, because of course they're wrong. But then that puts me in the same boat with them. So I have to work very hard to love them right where they are, try to listen and understand their point of view, and not let that anger color how I treat them, act, or converse. Because if it does, then I am no different, right? Mm-hmm. And so really all I can do is pray that I can imitate Christ in how I love people that disagree with me and how I converse around the issues. So
yeah, it's definitely that balance of righteous anger where you're frustrated with the almost, how do you not see this? And you want to like hold up the sign of like, God is love, and where are we go? Like, where are we coming from? Like, show me where in the Bible it says you have to be a Republican or be a certain color, and you get that anger. But like you said, we're no better sometimes of almost have to practice it with being with people. And I like to say you're almost like a detective or a scientist. You're constantly asking questions of, okay, why is your perspective that way? Where did you grow up?
Right.
Like, where is that root for them, and help them almost deconstruct in a way without them realizing almost.
And this is why, I've talked about on other shows, we've talked about a few times on here of, the biggest thing that the COVID era, I think, exposed for the church, beyond what we've talked about with Dr. Linville as far as the way that the worship services are set up, besides, the stuff that the stuff we talked about with the Cold War theology stuff, even though it's a part of it, is that what it really exposed is the lack of empathy being taught as a Christian value. The idea of we can listen to our enemies, quote unquote, even though they literally are our brothers and sisters. Yep. we can't listen to them and understand where they're coming from, because if we do, then the argument is that, well, we're listening to a deceiver, and so it's going to, it's the CRT debate of it's going to completely destroy the fabric of what our church is all about. And that's not necessarily going to be the case. Mm-mm. Especially when we know that these are actually our brothers and sisters at heart. You were about to add to that.
So I was going to say, this is what Phil and Sky have taught me. Everybody asks them all the time, what do you do in this situation at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, or when you're talking with your family around election time? What they taught me was just ask questions. Exactly what you were just saying. Instead of coming to the conversation with your own agenda or trying to change someone's mind, it is, important to ask them, why do you think that? Where did what is your point of view? What does the Bible say about that? You can ask questions, and that, I think, is the way to converse with people that disagree with you and show that you're listening to their point of view. And you know what? Sometimes I learn things. When I ask those questions and they have good reasons for why they believe what they believe. And I see how they could have come to that conclusion. Then I realize, well, you know what? There are two conclusions to this situation. It's yours and it's mine. And both of us have grounds for believing what we believe. So, again,
this goes back to what we talked about with, the truth, lies, and Twitter whole fiasco, because I don't get in nearly as much trouble as Phil does on Twitter, but that's mostly because
he brings it on himself.
I have maybe 3% of the amount of followers, and don't judge us on that number because you know how our math is. But one of the trends that we've seen on Twitter since November, but it's hyped up since January, is within Christian Twitter is this idea of, if somebody disagrees with you, you call them a liar and then you call them to repent. Even though the stuff that is being said, none of it is a lie. Some of it is stuff where it's not even false. It's the opposite opinion. And it's definitely not anything that anybody is needing to repent, going before God and saying, look how I have sinned. Having that different opinion is not a sin, but yet that's the way that it's being portrayed. And like you're saying, this is not a new thing. It's just that it's being exaggerated because of social media. Imagine that. Social media is exaggerating everything.
But also, I think, as you talked about too, we fast forwarded very quickly, where I don't think the conversations were had as much or as open. And so now we got to this very quick point where it was, all right, you're the one side or the other, pick one and go.
Right.
And so we didn't have this slow moving period to have good conversations.
So that's, I guess we would ask that to you, Christian, were these conversations that you were not necessarily having, but at least would have been okay with having with your dad before, we'll go back to 2015? Was this even something where it was like, I need to have this conversation with him, or at least I'd be okay with it? Or was it just the situation is now at the point where I have to have it?
So I had no idea until 2015 that there was anything I needed to think about. So until that time, I just believed everything I was told from my dad. Look, you guys, when I was 4 years old, sometime, between 4 and 7, my father would take me campaigning for him everywhere for Trent Lott, who was, if you guys don't know who Trent Lott is, look him up. I mean, he was in the House and the Senate for a very long time. And he and my father went to college together, and he is a good man. He is a good man, and I do love him, but there were some controversial things about him. At any rate, I remember, and this is what's so funny with my work now with the Girl Who Wore Freedom, I feel like I've come full circle and I'm doing what I was born to do. But at that young age, my father took me to the projects, and he was telling everybody to vote for Trent Lott, of course. And a man came to the door in a wheelchair, and he was missing a leg, half his leg. And I was so just upset by that. I'd never seen anything like that before. And I remember asking my daddy, what happened to his leg? And he said, young lady, that man gave his leg for your life and your freedom. And you need to thank him and every other veteran you see for the rest of your life. And so, from that moment on, as a young child, I believe that every word that came out of my father's mouth was the absolute truth. I was like his little disciple, and I never really thought for myself. I just went along and believed everything that people around him believed. And it was so commingled with the Christian faith that there was no separating it, because I looked at all of these people around me. They were good people. They were doing good things. They weren't filled with malice. And it wasn't until 2015 for me, there was a stark departure. I grew up during the time where Bill Clinton's deeds and actions were horrific, right? And we need to stand against them and fight for them. And here with Donald Trump, it was 100 times worse in my mind, but up to this point, I'd never voted for a Democrat, not once, would never even consider it. And in fact, when I finally did for the first time, I thought I was going to be sick. Like it was that, it was that ingrained in my body and my DNA that I could barely vote for anything that was not a Republican. And so that first time of me telling my father that I was not going to vote for Donald Trump was the first time I really stood up and made a stark departure. Up to that point, I agree with my father on every point. So I really was leaving what I knew to be my family, in a sense, and becoming stepping over to the other side. And it was scary and sad, very sad at the same time. And because you're out of this, echo chamber, and you feel ostracized and labeled as whatever you are, woke, liberal, and then you lose any platform you have to converse with anybody on a meaningful level. You're like a leper, right? Kind of thrown out on your head. And so, I'm still sorting that mess out.
No.
But I'll tell you what I heard. Sorry for interrupting.
No, you're
what
good.
I heard when I was a kid in whispers is what started coming to the forefront out loud starting in 2015 about we are the persecuted minority. Everybody's trying to take away our guns and take away our rights, and we have to, stand and fight. And, these, hooligans, Black people. When I was growing up, they were called jigaboos. Just the most horrible things, in secret that people would say or whisper under their breath about Black people. All of a sudden now, everybody was saying it out loud. And I was like, well, I guess the good thing about all of this is now people are actually saying what they really think and believe, and it's all out there. We can't hide it anymore behind Christianese, right?
And now with that, before we start transitioning into your documentary work, we're talking about, some deep, heartfelt pain, with your family. You talked recently, because how we are with calendars. Recently, you talked about the fact that you have recently had a different type of conversation with your dad related to this kind of stuff. And that a lot of it has to do with the fact that you were actually able to have that kind of conversation with him. Do you want to share anything about that side of it?
Oh my gosh, can you remind me what I said?
Not what you said, because I can't even remember what it was. It was while you were you were actually down there for a month or so, and everybody was making fun of you because you were starting to talk like you were from there again.
Yes.
But you were talking about the fact that you and your dad actually started to be able to connect and start having conversations, much more of an empathy level style conversation of him being able to see why you are saying what you are. and you being able to communicate with him that you do actually understand why he says the things he does.
Yeah, I mean,
is
I
that
think you're
jogging
talking about
anything? Because I can't remember the details.
Not really, because you know what? So much has happened in my life since last June. My father came to visit me, and I realized he had kind of crossed this Rubicon, and now he was in a space where he wasn't remembering hardly anything, and there were a lot of difficulties with his daily life. And I had to then go to Mississippi and live there for 3 months to sort of get my father's things sold, his affairs buttoned up, and moved into a independent living facility. And during that time, we would pray every morning, and we would read Sky's devotional. And he would also come to the table with Mornings with Jesus. And we really were talking about, these deep spiritual issues. And I felt like really growing as he would begin to digest what Sky was saying in his devotionals. He was kind of blown away by the wisdom of that. So we were talking on a deeper level. But what's interesting is I then have been away now since September of last year. And he does have short-term memory issues. And he is living in, this southern place where everybody thinks the same, talks the same. And without outside thinking, there's reversion right back to what they said before. So it was a sweet time with my dad, and it remains, but I do still think it is very difficult for him to separate his politics from his Christianity,
right?
And to see that there is a conflict with what he believes politically with his faith at times.
So, with that being said, you talked a little bit about, I'm trying to remember where we were going. This is why this is the good thing about not doing things.
I figured it'd be about the documentary.
I can cut these big things out.
Probably the documentary.
Yes, that's where
we're going next.
Yes, that's where we were going. Yeah. So you shared earlier about your oldest son, and you shared about how he really is the one that has kind of transitioned you into this new career, even though I would argue really it's not a new career for you, because you have been doing production and media for a long time, and we're hoping to be able to talk with you about that later. But you've kind of gone on this new career path and been very, very successful with it, at least to this point. So first of all, share a little bit about what it was that how your son did this, and then what that new career path actually looks like.
Sure. So I do want to mention someone else here that's instrumental to this new career path, but also to my development as a human and a Christian. And that's my husband, Jeremy. So Jeremy and I have been married now for about 28 years and heading to 29. And when we met, I thought he was a Christian, but his definition of Christian and my definition of Christian were kind of different. And he was raised in a
whole nother podcast.
It's a whole nother podcast. Whole nother podcast. So he was raised in a Catholic church, not really going to church, but said he knew there was a God and he was looking for him in any church he went to. And he also was a Navy brat, so he traveled all around the world. And he had a Democratic father and a Republican mother. And he'd gone to UVA. He's very, very intellectual. And so when I married him, that was the beginning of the unboxing of so many things. He pushed back on everything. This Christian culture I was steeped in, the way that I talked about politics, the fact that I never voted for a Democrat or didn't even really look at the candidates. I would just check the Republican boxes. Like he like held up my feet to the fire in just about everything and made me think, did my beliefs line up with my actions? And so my husband has just been an unbelievable gift to me. And he's always believed in me career-wise. So he saw how important creative stuff was. He saw the gift that I had, different things. And yes, I've been in radio and television production. I've been in theater. I've been a voiceover, on camera, print actress. I've worked as a producer, as a casting director. So I've like done a lot of different things, but never really had a business where I was actually making money. It was kind of all, very
We
hobby.
understand that side of it pretty well.
So I didn't feel very, successful in the world's eyes. But he's believed in me. And so he has given me a lot of freedom and opportunities that I wouldn't even have given myself, frankly. So when we moved to the Chicago area, the first thing he did, he wanted me to have something to do when we first got here because we knew no one. So he signed me up for pottery classes. And I was expressing my creativity there. And then he bought me voiceover lessons so I could learn to be a voiceover actor and stay at home. So financially and every other way, he's always been behind me, and I would be nowhere without him. And that's true in this particular case. My son Hunter was with the 101st Airborne Division. By this time, he was older and was, in the Army as an infantry soldier. And he had go to Afghanistan, come back, and he had won the Soldier of the Year for his division and was heading like to the big competition when he was disqualified for not having a certain class because his leadership didn't send him to this class. And so his consolation prize for being disqualified was that he got to go to Normandy for the D-Day ceremony. So he calls me one day and says, "Mom, the Army's sending me to France." And I was like, "We're going to France?" And he's like, "No, you're not going to France." And I was like, "Oh, just watch me." Because if you're a parent, that if your child is going to do anything, at all, you want to be there. But if it's something on that magnitude, you can't miss it. And so I had already had a 3-week trip planned to Italy, for crying out loud. We'd already paid for all the things. I was going to go July 3rd with my other son, Jacob, who had just graduated from high school. And I told my husband, I don't care what happens, come hell or high water, I'm going to France. And so my husband supported me in that. I was only there for 5 days, but he bought the plane tickets. He let us go. I thought my son was going over there to like reenact D-Day or something. He didn't know. I didn't know. When we got there, we realized that I didn't even know this was happening, but every year since 1945, the French have been celebrating their liberators and their freedom by having a big party, basically at the end of May, 1st of June, for about 3 weeks. They bring over World War II veterans, and they bring over the units that liberated them, primarily the 101st, the 82nd Airborne, the 173rd, and there are others, the 90th Infantry Division, the 29th Infantry Division, the Big Red One, like all of these guys that parachuted in or that landed on the beaches. They welcome them back, and the military sends honor guards there to be at all of these ceremonies. And so Hunter was selected to do that. So I was sent to France, and I found him on Purple Heart Lane in Carentan, France. They were walking down this road carrying the big 101st Screaming Eagle flag. It was a very special moment. And when I got to Purple Heart Lane, I felt like I'd stepped into a time machine where I was hearing, in the mood on the, music speakers. Everybody was dressed in 1940s clothes. And I was like, where have I landed? What is happening? Like, I was just so confused. And 15 minutes later, I met an unbelievable family where the woman, the mother, her name was Danny Patrice Boucherie. She was 5 on D-Day and remembered the paratroopers falling around her, coming off the beaches the next day, giving her gum and candy and chocolate and changing her life forever. And so those 4 days, they changed my life. And so it's been a whirlwind ever since.
So share a little bit. So your documentary that you're talking about there is called The Girl Who Wore Freedom.
Indeed.
And it's not just about that little girl that you just talked about that you met as, an elderly woman. You go through pretty much the full back history, the stuff that History Channel doesn't talk about. Yeah. Would that be accurate?
Oh, yeah. But, well, we're Americans. Have you ever seen a story that talked about the French perspective of World War II, or the, for crying out loud, the Germans or the Russians or the Poles? Like, no.
Typically, whenever we hear anything in the U.S. or the U.K. about the French, it's not in a good light.
No, it's always about surrendering. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But, this what blew me away was that I hadn't ever heard about what the French were doing in this little breadbasket of Normandy. I thought the French hated us just like everybody else. I thought they were stuck up and rude, just like everybody else in the US thinks. And in Normandy, granted, there are stuck up and rude people all over the world, and they tend to congregate in the big cities because everybody's in a rush and blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't where you are. If you're in Paris or New York, people are going to be rude. But in Normandy, I keep saying all the time, it reminds me of rural Mississippi, and the people are wonderful and they're so grateful for their freedom. And when I was there, they treated me like I had liberated Normandy. Like they bought all my meals, and they were just remarkable because I was an American. And this woman that I talked about, Danny, her mother helped the GIs, and father, they both helped them. They change a tire off of when the guys are coming off the beach, they change a tire and they're paid an American flag. They helped the American GIs find the Germans that were in the bell tower of their church. Her mother patched up a GI's arm. And then her mother, Cecile, found red and white parachutes and made a flag dress to resemble the American flag to honor those that liberated her. And she wore it in a ceremony in 1945. But after meeting Danny, they introduced me to all these other people that remembered the liberation, the occupation and the liberation, and who had, experienced so much loss and grief during those, 4 years. And I had no idea that the French lost 20,000 lives in the Battle of Normandy. I had no idea that their cities and towns were destroyed. And so when I learned that, I was like, oh my gosh, all of that trauma and grief happened. And yet here you are throwing this big party. How did this happen? And I wanted to know. And what I did learn is their intense grief and sadness began to morph into gratitude as they began thinking outside of their own pain and getting to know those that came and liberated them and the pain that they endured. And once they met them face to face, they never went back. They always, celebrated them for their freedom. So I thought, gosh, Americans need to hear this story.
And, this, for those that are trying to figure out how this connects to the first half, what she's talking about is it is the exact same process that she talked about growing up that she now has had as an adult related to the stuff going on in Normandy.
Yeah, good catch.
Stuff that she had never heard because that was not the cultural story for it. That once she was able to experience it for herself, she was able to see it in a much broader context, in a much more beautiful picture, both, in terms of her childhood in the South of what God was doing. And then in terms of the war effort, we can say again what God was doing in connecting these people and putting people into positions where they were able to help each other, regardless of your position on war, which we can do another time. The way that God orchestrates people's lives to be able to connect and experience and to have a better picture of the world that God has created is really the story that we are hearing today.
Yeah, what's interesting is, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
So what I was going to say, what's interesting is when I went over there, what I was overwhelmed with was the love that the French people had. And I know that God is love. And so I felt that God was in this place. And not only that, I saw the salvation story there. I mean, for crying out loud, right? This girl is wearing the parachutes that marked the symbol of their liberty. Like we wear a cross, right? Christ came, he died on a cross. We wear that cross on our necks or on our clothes, right? They were in a horrible situation. Who came to rescue them? All the allies to set them free. And in the middle of that, they come in parachutes, they come in boats. And so now all of those things are worn or celebrated by the people that were freed. And there is sacrifice and death. There is restoration. There's reconciliation. There's, rebuilding. And there's peace, joy, love, hope, all of those things there. And so I am a Christian. And at the same time, I am a filmmaker, right? And so I'm a quote unquote Christian filmmaker, whatever that means, or I am, right? In my mind, The Girl Who Wore Freedom has the salvation story baked in. And every veteran that I talked to talked about his faith holding them fast during the middle of that time. And I hope that people will also see that salvation story there, because the message is we have to ask questions of others. We have to listen to others. And then we have to celebrate and remember every year so that we can know what was done for us. That's what God told the Israelites to do, right? That's why all of those celebrations are baked in. That's why children are supposed to, be a part of those. That's why parents are supposed to teach them every day. I saw that living and active in France. That's how they don't forget. In America, I feel like we've lost that, right? Not only in our, geopolitical sense, like we don't even remember hardly at all the Revolutionary War, which, by the way, we only survived thanks to France
because of the French,
Yorktown. Yes, and if you don't know that history, go and look it up, because the relationships between the French and the Americans go back such a long way, and so it's so great that we're still keeping those alive, honestly. But when you look at that, what was I saying? Totally lost my train of thought. Were you listening?
Yeah, I think just to the fact that we don't reflect or celebrate enough as Americans.
Thank you. Yes, we don't remember any of those things hardly. What does 4th of July become? What does Memorial Day become? What does Veterans Day become? A day off. Yeah, we have some flags that line the road and maybe we have a parade, but mostly it's a party. It's a party, it's a barbecue, it's a day off work. Mm-hmm. Are we going to the places where, people have died? Not usually. Are we telling our kids? Not usually. What about church? Are we going each week and having communion and realizing what Christ did for us? Are we telling our children this? Like, we have cultural amnesia, not only spiritually, but also, in our history. And I do feel like that needs to change. And the French taught me that.
And this is part of why we wanted you to come on specifically to share your story, because we know of other people that have similar upbringings. But the ability to be able to share the story, first of all, but then on top of that, be able to share why sharing the story is so important, really can only come from somebody that understands the power of a story, which is what you do now, is you share the stories of others. So, in addition to The Girl Who Wore Freedom, you can also, if you want to hear more documentary talk, you can hear her on the Documentary First podcast, where they cover this kind of stuff. They do have a Patreon page as well, patreon.com/documentary first. But, ultimately, if nothing else, what we hope that you have heard today is, again, the importance of us both as a church, as Christians, and as American Christians actually sharing the story of the stories of other believers within our fellowship, not just the quote unquote sharing the gospel that gets hashtagged a lot, because the reality is, like we heard, these stories represent the gospel very well. So, Christian, we thank you for coming on. Stick around, those of you that want to hear more, because we're not sure yet if it's going to be a Patreon exclusive or if we're going to do another episode. But Christian's going to talk more about her career as far as how that relates to ministry as well.
Yep. So with that,
in the meantime,
we should be we'll be in the middle of our campaign.
We think it's May.
It'll be May for the middle of our campaign of trying to find 20 Patreon supporters. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can go to patreon.com/ministry misfits for us, as we are looking for, again, 20 different Patreon partners. So you'll find 4 different levels on there, ranging from $5 a month all the way up to $100, which at that point you are a ministry.
You're an executive producer at that
there
point.
We go.
So you get to tell us what to do, and then maybe we'll listen.
So 20 followers anyway along that lines where you can help support us to continue.
Yes, and that money will go to 20 patrons, 20 co-laborers is really what we're talking about. what that money will do is it will have us at any level, 20 patrons makes us quote unquote fully funded to the point where we are able to keep up exactly what we have. Additional money coming in at any of the other levels will allow us to continue to work with our partners such as TICFA with the TICFA tees, go buy those, as well as, Third Street, Tribe Collective, CSRM, Overwhelming Victory, all those the good partner relationships that we have at the moment. So from now until the end of May, I think I said it June 1st just because I couldn't remember how many days were in May and I couldn't get my calendar.
31.
There we go. So for the next 32 days, since we said June 1st, if you sign up for as a patron, not only do you get the stuff in your level, but you also get the nice Ministry Misfits mug that has our nice mugs on it.
Yeah, there we go. We didn't practice that one.
Yeah.
The first time we did it,
we've done it good,
on.
and then now it's just kind of going away. So, in addition to that, we hope that you will go and give us 5 stars.
5 stars.
It was a little delayed, but it was there. You can review on all of our different channels. We are still in the top 10 on Good Pods, so keep that up.
Do we pass Joel yet? That
we are past. As of this morning, we were 1 slot above Joel Osteen on the monthly. So keep boosting us up there.
There we go.
Yeah. So all that to say, you can follow us on all of our social media channels as well at Ministry Misfit. And again, I don't get in quite as much trouble as Phil Vischer does, but I get into some trouble. We were added.
You get in enough trouble.
We were added to 2 quote unquote discernment watch lists for the fact that we were talking multi-ethnic ministry on there, which is not that far away from what we were talking about today. Yeah. So, Christian Taylor, again, we thank you for coming on. We thank you for finding the space in your busy schedule.
Well, today all I'm doing is we're just ending a major renovation, so I'm trying to put my house back together. That's not as fun as this, so I was happy to be here. And one other thing, I'm wondering if you don't mind if I just share a little bit of this situation, but if people want to watch The Girl Who Wore Freedom, the only place to do that right now is on our site, thegirlwhoworefreedom.com. There is a big watch now button at the top. That means you can stream it. You can either rent it or buy it, $5.99 or $9.99, and then you can also buy a DVD for your parents or grandparents if they don't stream. What I'd like to do is offer your audience a little discount.
Oh,
so
nice.
We're gonna very soon, probably today or tomorrow, we're gonna put out. We're gonna give you guys a special link for a 50% discount. So it's $5.99 to stream, $9.99 to buy. We'll put it there. I think the password will have MM in it somewhere at the end. So we'll give your audience and those listening a 50% discount, thegirlwhoworefreedom.com. And then it is really important. We've not yet paid off the movie, and we had to terminate our distribution agreement because our distributors did not pay us the money that they were supposed to over the last year. They basically stole it from us. So we really could use all the support possible, either buying the film or you can make a donation on that page as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Christian's Voice. I don't tweet a ton, but I try. And then, there's also Documentary First on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So don't forget, I'll give you a 50% discount. It'll be hopefully linked in the show notes, thegirlwhoworefreedom.com.
Yeah, it'll be linked. It'll be linked in the show notes. It'll also be linked on her guest bio on our website, as well as we will put that link in the affiliate shop as well
and probably our Facebook group.
Yes, and we'll also add it to, and it'll be available on all the other social media platforms as well. So
we'll put out 2. So first off, Taylor or Christian, thank you, and I'm sure we'll probably put a timeline on that too, make it exclusive for a time period.
Oh yeah, it won't be forever. I can't do that forever.
So if you're listening to this in the future, so sorry you missed out.
But you can buy it for full price and still support.
That's right, and you can still you can still find the links that she just mentioned all in the show notes, as well as in her guest bio on the website, because we bought the website domain for 2 years, so it's there.
Okay, great. One other thing to tell you, I don't know if you guys know this, but Jason Rugg and Josh Lindsay, Jason is from, or was from the Holy Post podcast. And
Jason is those of you that do follow on Twitter, Jason is the one that I refer to for anything that anybody talks about cinnamon rolls. He is the expert to go to.
He is. And so he and Josh Lindsay are on my podcast. It comes out once a week. So that's Documentary First podcast on wherever you get your podcasts.
That's right. Perfect. And that will be linked as well. And if you have any desire to learn about the history and proper preparing of pastries, you can follow Jason on Twitter as well. Yes. So Christian,
isn't it at Jace Ruggie? At Jace
I think so. I think it's Jace Ruggie. Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Yeah, he and I have had a few conversations on there related to these topics. So, again, we thank you for coming on. We thank you for the coupon for the Girl Who Wore Freedom. So be sure to go check that out. Go check out the rest of her work. That you can find the links in the show notes and the descriptions and all of that. And we will see you all next week.
Bye, everybody.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/ministrymisfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/ministrymisfits.